The spring rain fell steadily on the Belgian countryside near the town of Arlon on the evening of May 9, 1940. 16-year-old Marie Dubois sat cross-legged on her bedroom floor, frustrated tears threatening to spill as she twisted the dial of her father's old radio set. The device had been her only companion since Papa left to join the Belgian forces 3 weeks earlier. And now it refused to produce anything but static and strange, rhythmic clicking sounds. What she could not have known in that moment of teenage frustration was that her broken radio was not broken at all, and the sounds crackling through its speakers would change the course of the opening days of World War II in Western Europe. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Within 72 hours, the mysterious signals Marie heard would lead to one of the most crucial intelligence discoveries of the early conflict, exposing a secret route that military planners had considered impossible. Marie had inherited her father's curiosity about how things worked. Henri Dubois was a telegraph operator for the Belgian railway, a man who could identify Morse code patterns the way others recognized familiar voices. He had taught his daughter the basics before he left, showing her how to distinguish between commercial radio traffic and military transmissions. Now, alone with her mother, who worked long shifts at the textile mill, Marie spent her evenings trying to capture news broadcasts from Paris or London, anything to feel connected to the wider world that seemed to be collapsing around them. The Dubois family lived in a stone farmhouse 3 kilometers outside Arlon, near the Luxembourg border. Their home sat on a hillside with a clear view across the forested Ardennes region, a landscape of deep valleys and dense woodland that most military experts considered impassable for modern mechanized forces. The house had belonged to Marie's grandfather, a veteran of the Great War, who used to tell stories about how the Germans had tried to push through this same terrain in 1914, only to be slowed by the difficult ground. Everyone knew, Grandfather Dubois would say with confidence, that any serious invasion would come through the flat plains of northern Belgium, where tanks and trucks could move freely. The Ardennes was nature's fortress. On that rainy May evening, Marie's radio problem had begun 3 days earlier. She had been scanning frequencies, looking for the BBC broadcast her teacher had mentioned, when suddenly the normal hum of radio static transformed into something else entirely. Sharp bursts of sound, rhythmic but irregular, unlike any broadcast she had heard before. At first she thought the radio had simply malfunctioned, perhaps a loose connection creating electrical interference. But as she listened more carefully, she noticed patterns in the noise, groups of clicks, pauses, then more clicks. It reminded her of something, though she could not quite place it. Her mother, Isabelle, barely noticed Marie's preoccupation. Work at the mill had intensified as they rushed to fulfill orders for military uniforms, and she came home exhausted each night, often falling asleep in her chair after a brief supper. This meant Marie had hours alone with the strange radio signals, time to listen and wonder, and gradually become convinced that what she was hearing was not random at all. By May 10th, Marie had filled 6 pages of her school notebook with careful recordings of the clicking patterns. She used a simple system, marking short clicks with dots and longer ones with dashes, organizing them into groups the way her father had shown her. She did not know Morse code well enough to translate the messages, but she could see that they repeated at regular intervals, always starting at dusk and continuing until well after midnight. Something about the precision suggested organization, purpose, military discipline. The morning of May 10th changed everything. Marie woke to the sound of her mother's voice, sharp with panic, calling up the stairs. German forces had crossed into Belgium, into the Netherlands, into Luxembourg. The invasion everyone had feared was happening. But the radio reports spoke of attacks in the north, near Liège and Maastricht, exactly where the fortifications were strongest, where everyone had expected trouble. Nothing about the Ardennes. Nothing about their quiet corner of Belgium where the forest grew thick and the roads were barely wide enough for farm wagons. Marie's mind raced to the strange signals. Could they be connected? She tried to explain to her mother what she had been hearing, but Isabelle was too frightened to listen properly. The Germans were coming. They needed to pack, to decide whether to flee south toward France or try to reach Brussels. Marie grabbed her notebook and her father's radio, insisting they were important, though she could not fully explain why. Her mother finally agreed they would go to the town, to Arlen, where they could get more information and decide what to do. The roads into Arlen were already clogged with people by mid-morning. Farmers with carts, families carrying suitcases, Belgian soldiers trying to move equipment through the chaos. Marie and her mother joined the crowd flowing toward the town center, where officials were supposed to be organizing evacuations. But when they arrived at the mayor's office, they found only more confusion. The military liaison, a captain named Bernard Tissot, was trying to calm a room full of panicked civilians while simultaneously receiving contradictory orders over a field telephone. Marie watched Captain Tissot for several minutes, noting how he kept asking the person on the other end of the line to repeat information about troop movements. He seemed particularly concerned about something happening to the east, toward Luxembourg, though all the official attention appeared focused northward. During a brief pause in the chaos, Marie made a decision that would have seemed absurd to her cautious nature just days before. She pushed through the crowd and placed her notebook on the captain's desk. Captain Tissot was 43 years old, a reserve officer who worked as a customs inspector in peacetime. He had been called up 3 months earlier and assigned to coordinate civil defense in the Arlon district, a position he had accepted with reluctance, knowing his administrative skills far exceeded his military training. He was not prepared for invasion, not ready to make life or death decisions, and certainly not expecting a teenage girl to hand him a notebook filled with dots and dashes claiming they represented enemy radio traffic. His first instinct was to dismiss her. They were in the middle of a national emergency. He had real intelligence reports to process, evacuation orders to implement, strategic decisions to coordinate with his superiors. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the precision of her notations, the careful timestamps beside each entry. Perhaps it was the fact that she claimed the signals were coming from the direction of Luxembourg, which aligned with his own unease about that supposedly secure eastern flank. Or perhaps it was simply that she reminded him of his own daughter, and he could not bear to crush her conviction with casual dismissal. Tissot asked Marie to wait, then took her notebook to a corner where a young signals officer was monitoring military communications. Lieutenant André Mercier was 26, fresh from technical school, and possessed the kind of systematic mind that made him excellent at his job. He examined Marie's notations for less than 30 seconds before his expression changed. He looked at Captain Tissot, then at Marie, then back at the notebook. What she had recorded, Mercier explained, was not standard military Morse code. It was a compressed format, a shorthand version that allowed rapid transmission of coordinates and unit designations. More significantly, the frequency she had noted was not one used by Belgian or French forces. The transmission schedule, the signal strength, the compression format, all suggested German tactical communications. If her timestamps were accurate, these transmissions had been occurring for at least 3 days before the invasion began, starting precisely when German units would have been moving into position for the attack. The implications were staggering. These were not transmissions from the northern offensive that everyone was focused on. The direction Marie's antenna faced, the signal strength she described, everything suggested the source was somewhere in or near Luxembourg, directly east of their position. But there were no reports of major German forces in that area. The Ardennes forest was considered impassable to modern mechanized armies. Every strategic assessment, every military plan, assumed the Germans would follow the same route they had attempted in the Great War, sweeping through northern Belgium where the terrain was favorable. Captain Tissot felt a cold certainty forming in his chest. He had spent 20 years as a customs inspector on this border. He knew the backroads through the Ardennes, the old logging trails, the river crossings that did not appear on military maps. He knew that while the terrain was difficult, it was not impossible, especially if you were willing to move slowly and accept the challenges. What if the northern offensive was not the main attack? What if it was a diversion drawing French and Belgian forces north, while the real thrust came through the supposedly impassable forest? He needed to report this immediately, but to whom? His direct superior was focused entirely on the northern situation. The telephone lines were overwhelmed with conflicting reports. If he made an official report through channels, Marie's radio intercepts would be dismissed as the imaginings of a civilian with no military training. He needed proof, or at least corroboration, something concrete that could not be ignored. Tissot made a decision that exceeded his authority by a considerable margin. He commandeered a military motorcycle and assigned Lieutenant Mercier to accompany him on a reconnaissance patrol toward the Luxembourg border. He told Marie and her mother to stay in the town hall where they would be safe, and promised to return before nightfall. Then he and Mercier rode east, following the road that led toward the border village of Sturpenich. The countryside seemed deceptively peaceful as they drove. Spring flowers bloomed in the meadows between patches of forest. The rain had stopped, leaving everything fresh and green. But Tissot noticed details that troubled him. Farm animals left loose in fields as if their owners had departed suddenly, fresh tire tracks on side roads that should have been empty, and most tellingly, a complete absence of refugees moving west. Everyone should have been fleeing away from the border, but these roads were deserted. They were 5 kilometers from Sturpenich when they heard it. A low rumble, like distant thunder, except the sky was clear. Tissot stopped the motorcycle and they listened. The sound was mechanical, unmistakable. Heavy vehicles, lots of them, grinding through difficult terrain. They abandoned the motorcycle and moved forward on foot, using the tree line for cover. What they saw from a hillside overlooking the border valley would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. The German army was coming through the Ardennes in force, not a small reconnaissance unit or a diversionary raid, but a massive mechanized column. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, support vehicles, stretching back as far as they could see through the forest. The column was moving slowly, yes, constrained by the narrow roads and difficult terrain, but it was moving steadily, organized, unstoppable. Thousands of vehicles, tens of thousands of soldiers, all flowing west through terrain that every Allied strategist had dismissed as impassable. Tissot estimated at least 2 full divisions in what he could see, and the column extended far beyond his sight line. This was not a secondary attack or a diversion. This was the main thrust, the primary offensive, and it was aimed directly at the weakest part of the Allied line. If these forces made it through the Ardennes unchallenged, they would emerge behind the French fortifications, behind the carefully prepared defensive positions, right in the rear of the Allied armies, that were even now rushing north to meet what they thought was the main attack. They watched for less than 10 minutes, taking mental notes of unit markings and vehicle types before retreating to the motorcycle. The ride back to Arlon was frantic. Tissot knew that every minute of delay could prove catastrophic. The Germans were already in the forest, already well along their route. Hours or at most days remained before they would emerge into open country, where their mechanized advantage would be overwhelming. At Arlon, Tissot bypassed his immediate superior and called directly to the regional military headquarters in Bastogne. He got through to a major on the operations staff and delivered his report in clear, concise terms. Massive German mechanized forces moving west through the Ardennes forest, estimated strength of at least 2 divisions and possibly more, moving along the Luxembourg border route towards southern Belgium. The major's response was exactly what Tissot had feared: polite skepticism. The northern offensive was in full swing. Reports were coming in of paratrooper drops and heavy armored attacks near Liège. Every available unit was being rushed north to contain the breakthrough everyone had anticipated. The Ardennes remained a secondary concern, a backwater, impossible terrain for serious military operations. Tissot tried to emphasize the importance of his intelligence, the corroboration between Marie's radio intercepts and what he had personally observed, but he could hear the dismissal in the major's voice. They would note his report, certainly, and send a reconnaissance aircraft when one became available, but resources were limited and priorities had to be maintained. The major thanked him for his diligence and ended the call. Lieutenant Mercier, who had been listening to Tissot's side of the conversation, looked devastated. They had seen the truth with their own eyes, understood the catastrophic implications, and now watched their warning being filed away as a minor footnote to the real action happening elsewhere. Tissot felt a rage building in his chest, directed not at the major who was simply following standard procedures, but at the strategic blindness that had led every military planner to assume that difficult terrain meant impossible terrain. Marie had been waiting in the town hall, watching Tissot's increasingly agitated attempts to convince someone, anyone, to take his reports seriously. When he finally set down the telephone receiver, she saw the defeat in his posture and understood immediately that his warning had been dismissed. Her mother tried to pull her away, suggesting they should focus on their own evacuation, but Marie could not let it go. She had been the first to hear the signals, the first to recognize that something was happening where it should not be. Her father had taught her to trust what she could observe and verify, not what others said should be true. She asked Lieutenant Mercier if he could use his equipment to pick up the signals she had been hearing. If they could record actual German transmissions, not just her transcription but the signals themselves, would that convince headquarters that the threat was real? Mercier considered the question. His monitoring equipment was more sophisticated than Henri Dubois' civilian radio, with better filters and recording capability. If the transmissions were still occurring, he could potentially capture and decode them in real time. They set up Mercier's equipment in the town hall, using Marie's careful notes to identify the exact frequency and transmission times. As evening fell on May 10th, they waited, listening through static for the clicking patterns Marie had first noticed 4 days earlier. Tissot used the time to organize what evacuation he could, moving civilians west while simultaneously trying to convince his superior to at least consider the possibility that the Ardennes was not as impassable as everyone believed. At 2100 hours, exactly when Marie's notes predicted, the signals began. Mercier's equipment picked them up clearly, stronger than they had been days before, which meant the source was closer. He worked quickly, transcribing and decoding in real time, his face growing pale as the message content became clear. These were German tactical communications, no question, unit designations, movement orders, coordinates for fuel depots and assembly areas. Everything referred to positions in southern Belgium, places the German army should not be able to reach for days if they were really stuck fighting through the northern fortifications. One message in particular made Mercier stop transcribing and reach for the telephone. Orders for a panzer unit to secure a bridge crossing over the Semois River by dawn on May 11th. The Semois was in Belgium, west of the Ardennes forest, which meant German armor expected to be completely through the supposedly impassable terrain within hours, not days. If that bridge fell intact, it would open a direct route to the French border and the rear of the Maginot Line fortifications. This time, Tissot did not call his immediate superior. He went directly to the French military mission that was coordinating with Belgian forces in the southern sector. The French took the report more seriously, perhaps because they had more to lose if the Ardennes truly had been compromised. A French intelligence officer arrived in Arlon within 2 hours, listened to the recorded transmissions, reviewed Marie's original notations, and heard Tissot's first-hand account of the massive column he had observed. The officer's response was gratifying and terrifying in equal measure. He believed them, which meant the situation was exactly as catastrophic as they feared. The French officer, a Captain Rousseau, explained what was happening with grim clarity. The German plan, as it was now becoming apparent, was brilliant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. The attack in northern Belgium was indeed a diversion, meant to pull French and British forces north into a carefully prepared trap. Meanwhile, the main German force, 7 full panzer divisions by current intelligence estimates, was pushing through the Ardennes where no one expected them. They would emerge behind the Allied armies, cut them off from supply and reinforcement, and encircle the best units France and Britain could field in a single massive pocket. The only chance to stop this disaster was to redirect forces immediately to block the German advance before it broke out of the Ardennes. But this required convincing the Allied High Command that their entire strategic assessment had been wrong, that the terrain they considered impassable had already been passed, that the diversion they were rushing to contain was not the real threat. Hours mattered. Every decision delayed, every unit that continued marching north instead of turning south made the German encirclement more certain. Captain Rousseau left immediately for French headquarters, carrying Mercier's recordings and Marie's notebook as evidence. He promised to ensure that her intelligence reached the highest levels of command, though he could not promise they would act on it in time. The French army was a hierarchy, where information flowed slowly upward, and orders flowed even more slowly downward. Changing the strategic direction of hundreds of thousands of troops required decisions from generals who were already committed to a different plan, who had staked their reputations on assessments that were now being proven wrong. Marie spent the night of May 10th in the town hall, unable to sleep, listening to the continued transmissions that confirmed everything Captain Rousseau had feared. The German advance was accelerating. More units were reported moving west. Coordinates crept steadily closer to the French border. By dawn on May 11th, the first German reconnaissance elements had reached the Semois River, exactly as the intercepted orders had indicated. The bridge Mercier had heard mentioned in the transmissions fell to German forces at 0600 hours, secured before French engineers could destroy it. The Allied response, when it finally came, was too little and too late. French units began to redeploy southward on May 12th, but by then the German panzer divisions were already breaking out of the Ardennes into open country. The terrain that was supposed to delay them for weeks had been traversed in 3 days. The defensive positions that were supposed to contain them were either outflanked or had not been fully manned because everyone expected the attack to come from the north. Captain Tissot remained in Arlon until May 13th, when the German advance made evacuation imperative. He personally ensured that Marie and Isabelle Dubois got on one of the last trucks heading west toward France. As he helped them board, he thanked Marie for her persistence, her careful observations, her refusal to accept dismissal when she knew she was right. Her intelligence had been accurate. Her warning had been timely. That it had not been heeded quickly enough to prevent disaster was not her failure, but the failure of a system too rigid to adapt when reality contradicted expectations. The remainder of May 1940 was a catastrophe for the Allied armies. The German breakthrough in the Ardennes became an encirclement that trapped the best British, French, and Belgian divisions in northern France and Belgium. The evacuation from Dunkirk saved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but left behind all their heavy equipment and destroyed the strategic cohesion of the Allied defense. France fell in 6 weeks, a defeat so rapid and complete that it shocked the world and convinced many that the Germans were militarily invincible. But not everyone accepted that narrative. In London, British intelligence officers compiled a detailed timeline of the invasion, trying to understand how such a catastrophic surprise had been possible. They interviewed dozens of survivors, collected hundreds of reports, and discovered references to a teenage Belgian girl whose radio intercepts had provided the first warning of the Ardennes offensive. The report noted that her intelligence had been accurate to within hours of actual German movements, and had been delivered to military authorities days before those movements became apparent through other sources. Had her warning been properly evaluated and acted upon, the report concluded, the German breakthrough might have been contained or at least significantly delayed. Marie and her mother reached France but found no safety there. As the German advance continued, they fled south, eventually joining the millions of refugees who clogged French roads during the collapse. They lost touch with Henri Dubois, who was among the Belgian soldiers captured during the encirclement. For 2 years they lived in uncertainty, surviving in a small town in unoccupied southern France, hoping that the letters they sent through the Red Cross might somehow reach him. Henri Dubois survived the conflict as a prisoner, held in various camps in Germany until liberation in 1945. When he finally returned to Belgium and reunited with his family, he found that their home near Arlon had been destroyed during the fighting in 1944, as Allied forces pushed east to liberate the country. But he also found that Marie's role in detecting the German invasion route had not been forgotten. The Belgian government awarded her a civilian medal for service to the nation. The citation noted that her vigilance and technical skill had provided crucial intelligence regarding enemy movements during the invasion, and that her efforts represented the best traditions of Belgian resilience in the face of overwhelming threat. Marie Dubois never sought publicity for her role in the events of May 1940. She became a teacher after the conflict, specializing in mathematics and technical subjects, and rarely spoke about the 3 days when her broken radio exposed one of the most significant military surprises of World War II. When asked by students or historians in later years about what she remembered most from that time, She consistently focused not on her own actions, but on the lessons she believed the experience taught. Military planning, she would explain, depends on assumptions about what is possible and what is impossible. The Allied strategists in 1940 assumed that the Ardennes forest was impassable to modern armies because the terrain was difficult, the roads were narrow, and previous doctrine said that armor needed open ground to be effective. They built their entire defensive strategy on that assumption, positioning their strongest forces where the terrain favored the attacker and leaving minimal coverage where the terrain supposedly provided natural protection. The Germans simply questioned that assumption, looked at the same terrain, and asked not whether it was easy to traverse, but whether it could be traversed at all if you were willing to accept difficulty and constraint. The signals Marie heard on her father's radio represented the German forces doing exactly what the Allies had assumed was impossible. They were moving through the forest slowly, yes, but they were moving steadily, and more importantly, they were moving unopposed because no one expected them to be there. The tactical communications she intercepted were routine coordination messages, the kind of traffic any army generates when organizing a complex movement. They were not encrypted or even particularly hidden, because the Germans did not believe anyone would be listening for signals from that direction. That a 16-year-old girl with a civilian radio happened to be listening, that she had enough technical knowledge from her father to recognize the patterns as significant, that she had the persistence to record and report what she was hearing despite having no official standing or authority. These were accidents of circumstance that nearly exposed the German plan before it could succeed. Nearly, but not quite. The intelligence was good, the warning was timely, but the institutional structures that should have acted on that intelligence were too committed to their existing assumptions to recognize truth when it contradicted their expectations. Captain Bernard Tissot, who had believed Marie when others dismissed her, who had risked his limited authority to investigate and report what he found, spent the remainder of the conflict working in intelligence coordination. He wrote extensively after the conflict about the dangers of strategic surprise, particularly surprise that results not from enemy deception, but from self-deception. The Allies were not tricked about the Ardennes, he argued. They tricked themselves by assuming that difficult meant impossible, that their assessment of terrain was more reliable than reports from the field, that a teenage girl with a radio could not possibly understand what trained military analysts had missed. Lieutenant André Mercier survived the invasion and escaped to Britain, where he worked with the Signals Intelligence Organization throughout the conflict. He maintained contact with the Dubois family after the conflict ended, and in his memoirs published in the 1960s, he devoted an entire chapter to Marie's role in detecting the German communications. He noted with particular irony that the radio receiver Henri Dubois had left with his daughter was a relatively simple device, not particularly powerful or sensitive, but it happened to be oriented correctly and tuned to the right frequency at exactly the moment when that information mattered most. Technology, he wrote, is only as useful as the human intelligence that interprets what the technology reveals. The bridge over the Semois River that German forces captured intact on May 11th became a symbol of how complete the surprise had been. French engineers were supposed to destroy all bridges in the event of an invasion, but no one had sent demolition teams to the Semois bridges because no one expected German armor to reach them. The German unit that secured the bridge did so without opposition, found the demolition charges had never been placed, and established a crossing point that allowed an entire panzer division to continue west without delay. That single bridge, left undefended because of assumptions about what was impossible, potentially shortened the French campaign by days and contributed directly to the speed and completeness of the Allied collapse. Historians debate what would have happened if Marie Dubois' warning had been heeded immediately. The consensus is that even with earlier warning, stopping the German advance through the Ardennes would have been difficult. The Germans had committed massive forces to the operation, and their tactical skill in mechanized warfare was superior to the Allied capabilities in 1940. But an earlier warning would have allowed French forces to reach defensive positions before the Germans emerged from the forest. It would have prevented the capture of intact bridges. It would have given the Allies time to organize a coherent response instead of reacting in confusion to an attack from an unexpected direction. Would it have changed the outcome? Possibly. Would it have slowed the German advance and reduced the scale of the Allied disaster? Almost certainly. The irony that a teenage civilian provided more accurate intelligence about German movements than the entire Allied military intelligence apparatus was not lost on post-conflict analysts. It led to significant changes in how intelligence was evaluated, with less automatic dismissal of sources based on the credentials of the observer rather than the quality of the observation. It contributed to the development of signals intelligence as a systematic discipline rather than an ad hoc activity. And it became a standard case study in military academies about the dangers of confirmation bias and the importance of remaining open to information that contradicts established assumptions. Marie Dubois lived to see many of these changes. She died in 1998 at the age of 74, having spent more than 50 years teaching mathematics and physics to generations of Belgian students. Her father's radio, the device that had captured those fateful transmissions in May 1940, was eventually donated to the Belgian Military Museum in Brussels, where it remains on display with a placard explaining its significance. The notebook, where Marie carefully recorded the clicking patterns she heard, is preserved in the museum's archives, a physical record of the 3 days when a broken radio exposed a secret that almost changed the course of history. The German invasion through the Ardennes succeeded not because of superior military capability alone, but because it exploited a fundamental assumption about what modern warfare required. Allied planners believed that mechanized armies needed open terrain, good roads, and favorable logistics. The Germans proved that mechanized armies needed determination, adaptability, and willingness to accept constraints in service of strategic surprise. They moved slowly through the forest, but they moved consistently, and by the time their presence became undeniable, they had already achieved the operational surprise that made their subsequent success possible. That a 16-year-old girl nearly exposed this plan 3 days before it bore fruit speaks to both the fragility of military secrets and the robustness of human observation. Marie Dubois had no strategic training, no military experience, no official authority. She had a radio, a notebook, and the technical knowledge her father had shared with her. She listened when she was not supposed to hear anything, recognized patterns when she was not trained to do so, and persisted in reporting what she found even when dismissed by those who should have known better. Her story is a reminder that intelligence, in both senses of the word, often comes from unexpected sources, and that wisdom involves knowing when to question what everyone assumes to be true. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.